and welcome back to another episode of Drug Cultures. I'm Sky Hawthorne, this is my show. All opinions expressed here are my own, as is all music. Did you like today's intro music? I think it's pretty catchy if I do say so myself. As always, nothing I say on this podcast should be taken as medical advice. I'm not a physician. I do not and will not recommend that anybody take any drug for any reason. All content produced here is for the purposes of education, entertainment, and occasionally harm reduction. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into China's drug policies, specifically vis-a-vis opium. Now, if you paid attention in history class, or if you've spent much time learning about the history of the drug trade, you've probably heard of the Opium Wars. Basically, the United Kingdom, sometimes with military support from France, as well as diplomatic and indirect support from the United States and Russia, invaded China to force open trade. And at the time, Britain's primary export product was Indian opium. By the end of the Second Opium War, Britain had twisted the arm of the Qing dynasty, forcing them to legalize the import of opium and granting Britain extraterritoriality, which meant that its merchants had immunity from Chinese laws. The treaties were famously unequal, and these wars left a deep scar on the Chinese economy and cultural memory, ushering in what would become known as the Century of Humiliation. But we're not going to be talking about the Opium Wars today, at least not primarily. Obviously, the Opium Wars are hugely important to understanding the arc of drug policy and economic upheaval in China, so we are going to talk about them some. But mostly we're going to talk about the Communist Revolution in China, and specifically the decade after that revolution. Starting in 1949, the newly formed People's Republic of China began a crackdown on narcotics that to this day remains unprecedented in scope, scale, and success. Within a decade, it could claim with some degree of accuracy that it had eradicated drug use and that China was no longer the sick man of Asia. Now, I want to make something abundantly clear. The Drug Cultures podcast is unequivocal in its support for the cognitive liberty of all human beings. I believe very strongly that if a person wants to take a mind-altering drug, they should be able to do so, regardless of whether it's coffee, cannabis, or opium. As such, I find the very idea of a war on drugs to be offensive to my sensibilities, regardless of whether it's led by America or China or some other power. That being said, not all drug wars are created equal, nor are they morally equivalent. While most of us have some idea how opium became so widespread in China, and the fact that Britain played a role in this, the story of how that chapter of Chinese history came to an end has gotten far less attention from drug historians. So I decided to take a closer look, and sure enough, was not disappointed. So enough dilly-dallying, let's get to it. This is the story of how Maoist China led the only successful drug war in modern history. You're listening to Drug Cultures. We'll be right back. Opium has a long and storied history in China. Its presence is much older than any one empire or dynasty, and certainly was around long before the British began importing it from India in the late 18th century. While the exact story of opium's arrival in China has been lost to the ages, it was probably introduced to the Tang dynasty by Arab traders over 1,000 years ago. During the Ming dynasty, which began in the 1300s and lasted until the 1600s, China's economy, population, and cultural capital all expanded dramatically. As China's importance on the world stage increased, foreign envoys from other countries would often bring gifts of opium as a tribute to the emperor or to other high-ranking Chinese officials. And it's in this time that opium as a habit became popular among the nobility, often used in the company of courtesans as an aphrodisiac and a social lubricant. During the Qing dynasty, particularly the reign of the Qianlong emperor in the mid-1700s, China was essentially a global superpower. And as the emperor launched a series of ambitious military campaigns, seafaring soldiers brought opium back from abroad, including the Philippines and Southeast Asia, where it became popular amongst a class of people who were well off, but certainly not nobility. We're talking military officers and government bureaucrats. Keep in mind that at this time, much of China under the Qing dynasty was starting to industrialize and commercialize. So as opium's popularity spread, it became intricately tied into certain key industries, particularly the sex industry. In the city of Canton, for instance, opium smoking on leisure boats was a popular pastime among the well-to-do by the end of the 18th century. Basically, drug-fueled sex cruises. Hard to imagine why that was so popular. Recognizing that opium had spread further than it had in the centuries prior and might end up posing a problem, Chinese authorities passed an anti-opium edict in 1729, one of the first known anti-drug laws ever. They then reaffirmed this edict in harsher, less ambiguous terms in 1799. By that point, however, there was a domestic market for opium, which the British were more than happy to fill in spite of multiple Chinese decrees forbidding this. The British already had an established trading relationship with China. Slaves mined silver in Spanish colonies in Latin America, and Britain was able to acquire a substantial amount of that silver by participating in the transatlantic silver trade, which they then traded for Chinese tea, which was becoming very popular in the United Kingdom. But both Mexico and Peru gained their independence from Spain in 1821, which meant it was suddenly a lot more difficult for Britain to trade in silver. So in spite of protests from the Qing government, the British East India Company began importing large amounts of opium into the port of Canton, now known as Guangzhou. The Emperor Daoguang became increasingly alarmed at the fact that opium had replaced silver as the currency of trade, and in 1838, he appointed Lin Zishu to go to Guangzhou and halt the opium trade by any means necessary, including executing opium smokers and anyone who enabled British trade. It was there that Lin Zishu famously burnt 20,000 chests, $2 million worth of British opium, a provocation that the British say made retaliation inevitable. I'm not going to attempt a play-by-play of the Opium War, because frankly there are a million podcasts by historians of Chinese military history that would do an infinitely better job on the subject. While the Opium Wars were complicated and the outcome far from a guarantee, the gist of what you need to know is that Western firepower and naval technology made the war essentially unwinnable for the Qing dynasty, and the treaties that were signed at the end of each war became known as unequal treaties. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 forced the Chinese to open 5 additional ports to facilitate British trade, forced the Qing to pay $20 million in war indemnity, and abolished the Hong monopoly, which had allowed a group of Chinese merchants to set tariffs on all imports. This treaty gave the British an unprecedented upper hand in their trade relations with China, and while it did not officially legalize the trade of opium, it made its prohibition increasingly difficult to enforce. In 1856, Chinese officials seized a British-registered vessel and its crew on suspicion of piracy, and in response, the British trained its cannons on Guangzhou once more, kicking off the Second Opium War. At the end of this war, the British forced another unequal treaty on the Chinese, and unlike the first, this one fully legalized the import of opium. These treaties were devastating not just because of the unrestricted flow of a powerful narcotic into the country, but because they decimated China's ability to maintain any national sovereignty. No longer able to administer its own carrots and sticks, the Qing Empire was now at the mercy of the carrots and sticks of scrambling Western powers, and this is really where the phrase "century of humiliation" comes from. Over the coming decades, China repeatedly lost territory to foreign powers such as Russia and Japan, and was no longer able to project its power within its own borders. In much of China, local warlords and foreign merchants had far more sway over the lives of everyday peasants and workers than the Qing government. And through this all, opium was a common factor. As economic hardships forced China to deindustrialize and poverty skyrocketed, opium, which was now affordable even to the working class thanks to the legal import of large shipments from India, spread like wildfire. There's a concept I find really instructive for understanding opium's relationship to poverty in China, and that's the idea of an assay, which in biology is something that you'd use in a lab to detect the presence of something else. Maybe a chemical agent that will turn a certain color if it detects cancer cells. In China in the 19th and early 20th century, opium was an assay for poverty and working class despair. When it had been confined to nobility and the officer class, it was a mostly harmless drug that could relieve pain, act as an aphrodisiac, and improve mood. But once it entered the lower classes, it took on an entirely different character, gripping millions of people who had no other hope in the bowels of addiction. Men spent what little savings they had on the drug, and women turned to prostitution to finance their families' addictions. In fact, opium-scooping escorts were some of the only unionized workers in early 20th century Shanghai. The poverty I'm describing would have been there with or without the opium, but the rapid spread of drug addiction, as it does today in America, made that poverty and despair much more visible. And after the fall of the Qing dynasty, the Republic of China that took its place talked a big talk, but did very little to actually address the opium crisis or curtail the power of local warlords and provincial leaders who were profiting from opium. Which brings us to the thing we came to talk about in this episode, communism. The Chinese Communist Party was created in 1921 as a direct result of the success of the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the USSR. Mao Zedong, inspired by Lenin and Marx's ideas, wanted to apply those same principles to a different economy, one that at this time was primarily agrarian and devastated by the influence of Western mercantilism. In the 1920s, communism spread throughout China, and in 1927, the nationalist government of the Republic of China began attempting to violently purge communists out of major cities. This led communist leaders to take refuge in rural areas and, ironically, helped them gain widespread support from the base of peasants they would eventually need to implement their version of socialism. When the Japanese invaded in the 1930s, the nationalists and the communists formed an uneasy truce so they could fight their invaders, but even during this time, the Chinese Communist Party continued to build political power. They were largely seen as more effective at defending peasants from Japanese brutality, and also began implementing their widely popular redistributive policies such as land reform, seizing lands from landlords and redistributing that land to the peasant class. After World War II, the Civil War resumed, and with Soviet support, the CCP was eventually able to defeat the nationalists, who fled to Taiwan and other nearby countries in 1949. And thus, the People's Republic of China was born. And yet, all the problems that had existed in the Qing dynasty and the Republic of China were still around. One of those problems, of course, was opium addiction. By 1949, there were more than 20 million opium addicts in the country, which was around 5% of the country's population. The rate of opium use was much higher still. The drug was truly ubiquitous, and there remained powerful figures in the country who profited from its trafficking. But beyond the drug itself, it's impossible to analyze the success of the anti-narcotics program that the communists would implement in the 1950s without fully appreciating the cultural shadow that opium had cast for decades. Again, I'm not saying that opium caused any of the decline that China experienced. Drugs always make easy scapegoats. But opium was seen by the masses as inextricably linked to China's century of humiliation. The British had used opium to force China to open its ports to trade. The Qing and the nationalists had all harshly condemned its use, but had acted impotently as Japan had used the opium trade to finance its own imperial conquests of China. The Japanese puppet state that it established in Manchuria had also talked a big game about eliminating opium, but likewise had no plan to do it. So the Chinese Communist Party, which in 1949 had a remarkable 6 million active members, recognized that opium was seen as synonymous with the failures of old China. And it's important to understand that for the CCP, building a new China with a new identity was just as important as implementing socialism. Without the widespread support of the Chinese people, eradicating a drug that 5% of the population was addicted to would have simply been impossible. Likewise, it would not have been possible without the 6 million active CCP members. Starting in 1950, the Government Administrative Council of the People's Republic issued a General Order on the Elimination of Opium and Narcotics, which made clear the party's intention to eliminate the distribution and use of opium. But it wasn't until 1952 that this anti-narcotics campaign really shifted into high gear. On August 10, 1952, authorities began undertaking mass arrests of suspected drug manufacturers, growers, and traffickers. Party officials expected to uncover around 250,000 drug producers, but the actual number ended up being closer to 400,000. Of those, a total of 80,000 were arrested, 30,000 imprisoned, and 880 were put to death. How was an operation of this scale undertaken so quickly? There are some fascinating contradictions in this story, which I will get to, but the success of the anti-drug campaign rested in the fact that the Communist Party had the social and political power to mobilize millions of ordinary people into taking an active role in drug eradication. This was known as the mass line and was a key feature of Mao Zedong's political philosophy. In his vision, the Communist Party existed to hear the problems of ordinary peasants and workers, translate those concerns into policy, and then use its political apparatus to mobilize the masses into collectively enacting that policy. In the case of opium eradication, this meant holding public rallies in broad daylight, often attended by thousands of people, where speakers would testify about how opium addiction had torn their families apart, and drug criminals were encouraged to step forward and admit to their crimes so as to avoid the worst punishment. These events blurred the line between political rally and public trial, and people often gathered in the hopes they'd get to see a drug kingpin get executed. One CCP official in Shanghai reported that hearing drug dealers confess to their crimes simply fed the hate and anger of the masses, motivating them to take matters into their own hands and stamp out drug use in their communities. It got to a point where the social pressure was too much to bear for some drug suppliers. One rally in the city of Xi'an drew a crowd of 150,000 people. That's twice the capacity of Wembley Stadium, just imagine that. At this rally, more than 700 people chose to spontaneously self-report their own crimes. Out of guilt, maybe, or the hope that they would be treated more leniently if they confessed. Drug users were treated with more compassion than drug dealers, but were still forced to give up their habit. Only very rarely did this involve any sort of residential treatment program. Usually it just meant rehabilitation at home. And the phrase that was often used to describe it is under surveillance of the masses. So why do I say there were fascinating contradictions in this process? Because the success of the anti-narcotics campaign rested heavily on the political mobilization of millions of people, but the Chinese government desperately did not want the extent of China's drug problem to make it into the Western press. American officials were already accusing the People's Republic of China of trafficking heroin into Japan. As such, the Communist Party undertook their 1952 anti-narcotics campaign in secret, leaving absolutely no paper trail. This is especially remarkable when you realize that propaganda sessions were a core part of the campaign, and none of this propaganda was ever written down or publicized over the radio. Instead, it was disseminated from the top down by Communist Party officials and then enacted all over the country at a hyperlocal level. It's estimated that more than 70 million people attended anti-drug propaganda sessions. In many of these sessions, officials not only stressed the relationship between opium and imperialism, but also tied the anti-narcotics campaign in with the Korean War. Maoist China had allied with the communists in North Korea, and stamping out opium use was portrayed as a way that regular Chinese citizens could resist America and aid Korea. The CCP also worked hard in its propaganda to brand opium use as counter-revolutionary. Because despite the many anti-opium edicts and decrees that came before the communists, this idea of the opium smoker as something luxury and quintessentially Chinese had persisted in the popular imagination. Fancy opium pipes were still status symbols. So opium use had to be rebranded to the masses as something that would take away your labor power and ruin your ability to take part in constructing or defending a new socialist society. It's equal parts remarkable and tragic to read about this period of time, because on one hand, it's just insane that any government could pull off an operation on this scale without leaving any written record of the policy, and it speaks to the incredible popularity of the fledgling communist regime and the tactical effectiveness of mass-line politics. But it also speaks to a real darkness in the human psyche when you look into the details of what happened, particularly the way in which distrust was sown in society and even within families. The amount of stories I've seen of wives turning their husbands in, daughters turning their fathers in after catching them smoking opium, is quite frankly disturbing. I think more than any other drug war, I really do understand the moral logic of why China waged this one, but it's still so shocking to see families ruptured as a political strategy, to see organs of the state turned against people whose only crime, regardless of whether or not they're addicted, is using a psychoactive substance or even selling that substance. Scarier still is that this hate was politically, intentionally engineered. After the first wave of anti-drug campaigns had limited success, a report to Chairman Mao identified a lack of widespread hate as a key reason the campaigns had failed in some cities. So the successful 1952 campaign recognized that mass hate, unavoidable and powerful enough to turn loved ones against each other, needed to be mobilized if opium was actually to be eradicated. Now, in spite of my objections to the whole principle of the thing, it is hard to argue with the campaign's effectiveness. By 1953, China was publicly making pronouncements that drug use had been eradicated entirely, and that it was no longer the sick man of Asia. Amazingly, this claim was not far from the truth, although there were some fascinating exceptions that we'll get to in a bit. China had eradicated, or at least dramatically reduced, opium use in pretty much all of its most densely populated cities. But this was the 1950s, the era of the Red Menace and McCarthyism, and American propagandists were still using their massive platforms to spread falsehoods about China's drug policies. Probably the worst of these propagandists was a man by the name of Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics through some of the worst years of American drug policy. His accomplishments included the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which effectively made marijuana federally illegal nationwide, and the 1951 Boggs Act, which set mandatory minimum sentences for marijuana possession at 2 to 10 years. Now, Anslinger was obsessed with the idea that communist China was responsible for the trafficking of narcotics, particularly heroin, into the United States, and this was a narrative that proved very useful for America's geopolitical goals. It still hadn't recognized the government of the People's Republic in any meaningful capacity, and painting it as a government of gangsters and drug criminals gave the US an excuse to keep the PRC out of China's seat at the United Nations. Of course, the vast majority of these opiates were actually being trafficked by nationalist Chinese forces, American allies who were operating primarily in the jungles of the Golden Triangle, Burma, Laos, and northern Thailand. And even in the 1950s, several CIA reports were starting to show this. But Anslinger continued to double down on blaming China for the narcotics trade, which put China in a tricky position. Because for all the success they'd had in major cities, they couldn't risk any narcotics escaping from their borders if they wanted to achieve international legitimacy. So this meant taking their eradication campaigns to the countryside, which included parts of the country where the Chinese government still struggled to extend its control. Despite its reputation by people who, quite frankly, don't know a lot about China, China is actually an extremely diverse country with 56 recognized ethnic minority groups. While Han Chinese are the dominant ethnic group in the PRC, many minority groups were very quickly assimilated into the communist project, often even before liberation was declared in 1949. But other groups hung on to their regional autonomy for quite some time. For some of these groups, opium production was central to their local economies and livelihoods. One of the most fascinating stories of the Communist Party's opium eradication campaign is how it addressed opium growing in Liangshan, an autonomous prefecture made up primarily of people from the Yi ethnic group. The Yi people had a highly regimented caste system that can be roughly translated into 4 levels: aristocrats, commoners, indentured servants, and slaves. The Yi people in the region had also been growing and trading opium for decades, which had allowed them to stockpile weapons and achieve dominance over the local Han Chinese in a way that didn't really exist anywhere else in China. As such, the PRC did not want to engage in an all-out war with this ethnic group, and at first pursued a policy of containment, arresting Yi traffickers wherever they were spotted. This didn't really work at curtailing the outflow of opium, however, and eventually, party officials began complaining that the PRC was even allowing a slave-based society to continue existing at all. Slavery, they protested, was fundamentally incompatible with communism and indeed basic human decency, and couldn't be allowed to continue. So starting in 1956, after launching some unsuccessful and bloody attempts at forced opium eradication the year before, the Communist Party began instituting what it called democratic reforms, which is really just fancy language for a slave revolt. They used the same techniques of mass line politics that they used in the 1952 anti-narcotics campaign, only this time the mass line was dominated by the servant and slave classes. Land was seized from aristocratic slave owners and was redistributed to the peasants and freed slaves, which created a large and loyal base of support. The slave-owning class staged a counter-revolt, trying to purge the communists and take back their land, but the new support base, made up by freed Yi slaves, fought back alongside Han Chinese communists. Eventually, the revolt was put down, slavery was fully abolished, and with the society of the Yi people having been forcibly restructured, it was much easier for the communists to successfully eradicate opium in Liangshan by the end of the decade. Now, this drug-free period of China's history continued for several decades, and even most American officials, including the most hardened anti-communist ones, were forced to admit by the mid-1960s that China had essentially eliminated the drug trade within its borders, and was not a significant exporter of narcotics either. This lasted until the end of the 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping took the reins of the party after Chairman Mao's death. At this point, China had begun the process of engaging in diplomacy with the West, and the PRC was finally in China's seat at the UN, and after Deng became chairman, he started instituting a series of policies that ushered in a period of liberalization. And these are largely decisions that are praised in the West because of how they reopened China to Western markets and allowed us to purchase cheaper Chinese goods. And there is a lot of good that can be said about liberalization. It meant that no man-made catastrophe on the scale of the Great Leap Forward which created famine conditions that led to the death of tens of millions of people, was likely to ever happen again. But restructuring the Chinese economy to rely on exporting to the West was deeply unpopular with large segments of Chinese society, who saw it as a betrayal of the communist principles that had freed them from a century of economic imperialism. This sense of betrayal, of capitulation to foreign markets, was actually a huge contributing factor to the now famous Tiananmen Square protests. And speaking of opium, market liberalization, as one might expect, made it virtually impossible for China to keep up its image as a drug-free nation. But this didn't stop it from trying. For decades, the Communist Party and its media mouthpieces denied that a drug problem had returned to China. And to the extent that drug addiction was acknowledged as a resurgent problem at all, either by the government or by state-aligned media, it was treated as a virus that had incubated within and spread from the capitalist West. But the problem was, China had abandoned a core principle of Mao Zedong's vision of socialism, and that was independence from foreign markets. While it had retained an impressive degree of state control over its economy, it had opened itself up to countless vectors for potential drug trafficking, and its internal attempts at drug control and drug eradication still relied on the same approach that it had used in the 1950s. That is to say, creating an environment of such intense stigma that there was nowhere for drug dealers or even drug users to hide. But this also meant that as drug use spread, including heroin and other drugs that were objectively much more lethal than a drug like opium, there were incredibly limited resources for drug users to use their drugs of choice safely. So unsafe drug use spread like wildfire. In 1990, there were 70,000 registered drug users in China. By 2005, there were well over 1 million. In the 1990s, as intravenous drug use spread rapidly, so did HIV/AIDS. Much like in America, the Chinese government massively downplayed the extent of the epidemic, arguing it was a disease that afflicted only immoral societies. It wasn't until the year 2000 that the Chinese government finally admitted it had a long-term problem with drugs and with AIDS on its hands. As anyone who tracks global drug policy will know, trying to suppress a drug epidemic without providing harm reduction tools to drug users rarely ever works. If you listen to episode 2 of Drug Cultures, we see a similar thing happening in Thailand in the mid-2000s, whose government launched a politically motivated war on drug users and also saw rising HIV rates as a result. And again, that's still something we're seeing to this day here in the United States, which lags behind most other major developed countries that have needle exchange programs, and where intravenous drug use is still a major vector for the spread of communicable disease. If you've made it this far in the episode, you may wonder what point I'm trying to make. If drug prohibition is always bad, and I believe it is, then why did I spend so much time speaking relatively favorably about China's anti-narcotics program? The answer is that, as I've said before and I'll say again, drug politics is rarely ever just about the drugs. Drug control is an important tool for enacting a political vision and consolidating power, and too often people in the drug media space are far too quick to assume that all drug control initiatives come from basically the same ideology. But while I certainly will not defend Mao's tactics or his weaponization of public hate toward nonviolent drug offenders, I think it's important to clarify that the Chinese anti-drug campaign of the 1950s came from an entirely different agenda than the American war on drugs. The American war on drugs is, by design, a war that cannot be won, because the power brokers behind it do not want it to be won. We have the highest per capita incarceration rate of any country on Earth thanks to our drug war, which is really just a war on drug users. Private prisons, police unions, and pharmaceutical companies all benefit tremendously from a society that continues to prosecute drug users for exercising their cognitive liberty. And if illicit drug use were to actually be eradicated, or those drugs were to be made legal, those powerful industries would take a massive financial hit. In the US, drug prohibition is a tool of capitalism. In China, drug prohibition, for better or for worse, was seen as a tool to escape capitalism. There's nothing inherently socialist about drug prohibition. In fact, other socialist countries have done the opposite. Bolivia, for instance, has made legalizing and nationalizing the coca industry a key focal point of its version of socialism. But unlike in Bolivia, where indigenous coca use is seen as a point of national pride, opium was seen as a foreign vice imposed by capitalist powers, and eradicating it as the only means for China to reinvent itself. And in doing so, the PRC was able to achieve other socialist goals in the process, including land redistribution and the eradication of slavery within its borders. Could these positive changes have been implemented without the pretext of drug control? I have no idea. Scholars debate the topic as fiercely as they debate whether land reform and rapid industrialization could have been accomplished under socialism without leading to the deadliest famine in history. But no understanding of contemporary China could be complete without understanding how China was able, for several decades, to eradicate drug use almost entirely in a country with hundreds of millions of people. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is Drug Cultures. Stay tuned. As always, if you enjoyed what you heard, give us a follow on Twitter at DrugCulturesPod, shoot me an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com, or give the show a follow on Instagram at consciousness_cultures. That's consciousness_cultures. I had to change the name of the account because any sort of drug content gets suppressed by Meta. Thanks, Zuck. Don't know what I'd do without you. Until next time.